Our next panelist is Janet Bax, who recently retired from her role at the Council of Canadian Academies as project director, but I'm told that that is not what she's going to be speaking about this evening, although she did shepherd multiple assessments through the council machinery. Janet, prior to that, held a number of senior positions with the Government of Canada, at Environment Canada, the Deputy Prime Minister's Office, and the Minister of Canadian Heritage Office, but also at the provincial level as well, and as well in civil society, in the nonprofit sector. And it's my understanding that that is part of what she's going to be focusing her remarks on, so taking us to another level, another universe and context and history. Janet.
Thank you. And it's interesting because I see Margaret, you there, you and I did the Ontario government together so many years ago.
1976.
Oh my goodness. Anyway, before I get started, I'm not going to tell you what I did, but I am going to draw on what I did for my remarks. I think that the 50th assessment of the Council of Canadian Academies should be that age-old question that has never been answered, which is the state of S&T and why can't we get it right in Canada? Honest to God, reading this book is so instructive, because that issue of why we can't get it right in Canada, it goes back so many years, and still, like, we've done 2 assessments. We did IR&D, and we still don't have the answers, so it has to be the 50th. Sorry. Anyway, the authors of this book, I so enjoyed reading this book. Not necessarily to learn anything new, but to have the story told in a way that made really good sense to me. And outlining the evolving role of science and scientists in government policy, and in drawing the distinction between the management of science and the conduct of science. It was very illustrative in that sense, and also interested in science. So they were late to the game. So I'm going to talk from the deck and the engine rooms of the provincial boats and of the federal boats. And I'm going to draw, as I say, on these are very, very personal observations. They're not fact. But so I started in the Ontario government in the 70s and worked through to the 80s. And I have to say that science played a relatively minor role in those days. But saying that, I also say that I have a huge sense of accomplishment from those years. We worked on the Constitution. Bill Davis was our premier. Before that it had been Robarts. And Bill Davis knew his constituents. He knew Ontarians so well. When we did the Constitution, he said, you can talk about anything, you can suggest changes to anything, but don't touch the Queen and her role. And because he knew that the Ontarians in those days didn't want that particular thing touched. And very, very interesting how we accomplished a great deal as policy analysts. We were expected to get the data and the evidence. So why do I say we accomplished a great deal? And what are some of the factors that I think were key for us being able to accomplish more than I believe we were able, or I was able to when I was in the federal system? I think there was a very high level of trust between senior members of the public service and the political levels, and with the electorate. So I worked first under Bill Davis, and we were asked to actually go and meet with the Premier and with deputies and with our ministers. and to discuss the following issues, whatever that happened to be. So you got to meet with the ministers, you got to meet with the deputies, you got to have a discussion about what the issues were. And I think that that level of trust also extended to the electorate, who felt for the most part, I'm not saying that there weren't scandals and things that happened. I mean, we all remember Bramley and all sorts of things that happened under Bill Davis, but for the most part, I think the electorate felt that policy was done in their interests. There was that sort of bond that held between the government and the electorate. Do you think that today, if Mark Jackard could make the case to Ford about the introduction of a carbon tax and how it would be good for the Ontario economy, that Ford would believe that evidence? Absolutely not. But back in those days, that sort of discussion could take place when sound evidence was presented, and we had economists who worked with us. We had the so-called scientists working within government, and they were trusted in a way that I think has been slightly eroded now, and I'll come back to that. I think the issues also were less complex in those days. I think they were more straightforward to deal with. And I think there was less social media, so you didn't have a bombardment of everybody and anybody who had something to say on the issue entering into the discussion. You know, there were letters that were written and so on, but it wasn't that instantaneous bombardment from all sides engaging on the issue. And so probably it was easier to promulgate policies in those days. We, the public servants, were expected to gather the data, the evidence, and present it. We understood that when we made a recommendation or when we presented our options to ministers, that was the beginning and end for us. It was up to politicians to make and take those decisions, as it still is. And I think that trust has largely eroded today. I think the electorate tend to be much more wary and suspicious of government programs and policies as a result of scandals in areas such as health. Think about tainted blood, exposure to pharmaceuticals and products such as thalidomide, Agent Orange, etc., and the environment. You think about Love Canal, the Sydney tar ponds, the decline of the fish stocks, nuclear safety, but ironically, and the book makes this observation, it was these very issues that also gave more prominence to the role of science in policy. So it's an interesting dichotomy that happened. I want to just go back for a minute to my time with the Ontario government, and because while I was in the government and also after I joined the federal government, I joined Foreign Affairs. And I want to talk about the role of our science advisors, the science advisors in the federal government. I'm not sure that science advisors still exist in the federal. They do, as part of the Foreign Affairs. I think their role is significantly reduced, but back in the day, almost every major, certainly every major post had two really important, and why those people, I mean, they were so important for us because they helped to explain Canada to the country in which they served. And many, many times, I will refer to the States because I was in New York at the time and on post, when there was a crisis that happened, Quebec Hydro, whatever it happened to be, those academic advisors and those science counselors were absolutely key in going to the governments and explaining what the policy was and engaging in discussions, engaging in the dialogue, and really, I think, advancing Canada's cause and Canada's positions. And I think that that role has been eroded enormously now. Because I want to talk about, I had said before that I thought that it was easier in the provincial government because the issues were less complex. And of course, we all remember the Brundtland Commission in 1984, sustainable development, and how issues became so intertwined. You couldn't deal with one issue without it impacting another issue. But departments in the federal government were not set up to work collaboratively. And I don't know how many people in this room worked in the federal government when I did, but I have to say that science operated in huge silos. I worked with the Minister of Environment. The Minister of Environment in the days in which I worked there was also the Deputy Prime Minister, so had quite a bit of heft. And if we dared to even say that we were going to go and look at the science from, let's say, MNR, from the Ministry, the Department of Natural Resources, we would be hauled into the Minister's office. I don't care what they say, I don't want to hear that. And so the science operated very much in silos. The issues that we were dealing with were complex and had to be dealt with together and in collaboration, but the science was very much for the particular department. And whose science could be trusted? When we went to Geneva, when we went to Paris to have our discussions about climate change and negotiations, we all took our science there. We took the NGOs, we took our science, but whose science could be trusted? And I think this also contributed to the electorate saying, you know, well, on vaccines, for instance, whose science can I believe in? Anyway, I'm rambling here, and I've got to wrap this up because we want to leave as much room for discussions. But I want to say that I'm not saying that science is not important. I'm saying that I think science is tremendously, tremendously important, and it needs to be made understandable. And I use as, I guess, the best example that I have lived through is the Canada-US Air Quality Agreement that was signed in 1991. There was an understanding then that the sulfuric acid, that our lakes were acidifying. And the scientists came up with this wonderful term of acid rain. And that term just so engaged the public. Our lakes are turning into acid. And so the whole notion of what can we do to prevent that was something in which civil society, the scientists, and the political machinery engaged in, and I think we saw a huge success in that area. And I would say it's one of the most successful areas in which I have been engaged. And I'm going to leave it there, just because I know we've got to get on, but anyway, thank you very much.